Alright, what is going on, guys? Today we're gonna be looking at loops in Python. Now, before I get started in this video, I want to say if you're looking for internships or tips on internships, check out the first link in the description. It's gonna take you to my newsletter where I send out weekly tips and internships to you guys. Um, After you subscribe, it should take about 1 to 2 minutes to appear in the inbox of your email. And in there, you'll also see the coding directory, which is my complete guide on how I got my internships. But with that out of the way, we're going to learn about loops today. So, in our everyday lives, we tend to repeat a lot of the processes without noticing. For instance, if we wanted to cook a delicious recipe, we might want to prepare our ingredients by chopping them up. We chop and chop and chop until all of the ingredients are the right size. At this point, we stop chopping. Now, if we break down our chopping task into a series of three smaller steps, we have an initialization, which is ready to cook, and have a collection of ingredients we want to chop. We'll start at the first ingredient, a repetition. So we're chopping away, we're performing the action of chopping over and over again on each of our ingredients, one ingredient at a time. An end condition. Now we see that we have run out of ingredients to chop, so we stop. So in programming, this process of using an initialization, repetitions, and an ending condition is called a loop. In a loop, we perform the process of iteration, which is repeating tasks. Now, programming languages like Python implement two types of iteration. One is an indefinite iteration, where the number of times the loop is executed depends on how many times a condition is met. And then a definite iteration, where the number of times the loop will be executed is defined in the advance, usually based on the collection size. Typically, we find loops being used to iterate a collection of items. In the above example, we can think of our ingredients that we want to chop as collections. So, some collections might be small, like a short string, while other collections might be massive, like the numbers between 1 to 10 million, let's say. But don't worry, loops give us the ability to masterfully handle both ends of the spectrum. The simple but powerful concept saves a lot of time and makes it easier for us to work with large amounts of data. Now, in this lesson, we're going to learn how to use Python to implement both definite and indefinite iteration on our programs. Look over the provided diagram, then go to the next exercise. All right, so let's say you are getting punished at school and you're forced to write, I will not write smelly code, I will not write smelly code, like over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's simply just not feasible. Your hand will just break off because you're writing the same stuff over and over. So that's where the loops come into play. Now, why loops? So before we get into writing our own loops, let's explore what programming would be like if we didn't use loops or couldn't use loops, right? So let's say we have a list of ingredients and we want to print every element of the list. If we only use print, our program might look like this. So it's the same line of code, it's just this number is just being incremented by 1 in the index every time. Now, it's still manageable since we're just writing 5 print statements here, but imagine if we had to do 10 or 24,000 or 100 million. It would take an extremely long time, and by the end, we would still end up with inconsistencies and mistakes. So don't worry about this too much because that's how like loops will help us, right? So don't worry about that. Now, using 10 print statements, print out, this can be so much easier with loops. Now, so doing that, we can do print, print. It's gonna be so much easier with print. Now, I can copy and paste, right? Like that's the modern solution really. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I can of course just copy and paste, right? Like with no worries. But you have to realize, like, if you're doing it by hand every single time, like, even if you're copying and pasting, like, let's say we had to do this like 100 million times, it would take you a long time, probably days or weeks. And even at the end of it, you may have some mistakes or you may have not done the right amount of times, right? So let's look at for loops. Now, for now, we can appreciate what loops do for us. So let's start with the first type of loop that we're going to learn today, which is the for loop, a type of definite iteration. Now, in a for loop, we know in advance how many times the loop will need to iterate because we will be working on a collection with a predefined length. In our examples, we'll be using Python lists as our collection of elements. Now, with for loops on each iteration, we'll be able to perform an action on each element of the collection. Before we work with any collection, let's examine the general structure of a for loop. So you would just do for, and then like a temporary variable, like we'll say x. For x in, and then you have to write it in collection, so we'll say in or in numbers or something like that. And then colon, and then you have an action. So let's break down each part of it. First, a for keyword indicates the start of a for loop. Then you have a temporary variable that is used to represent the value of the element in the collection the loop is currently on. And then an in, a keyword that separates the temporary variable from the collection used for iteration. A collection to loop over. In our examples, we're going to be using lists for this. And then an action to do something on each iteration of the loop. Alright, now let's link these concepts back to our ingredients example. This for loop prints each ingredient and ingredients. So it's very simple. So for ingredient, now you don't have to like do anything to define ingredient. It's just gonna it's a temporary variable, so you don't need to worry about it. And it only exists within these two lines. So you can't use it here or you can't use it before, right? If you do use it before, make sure you initialize it, right? Alright, now with that being said, so basically for every ingredient in the ingredients list, print out the ingredient. The ingredient is the temporary variable here, and then ingredients is our collection. And then print ingredient was the action performed on every iteration using the temporary variable of ingredient. This code will output milk, sugar, vanilla extract, dough, and chocolate because it's whatever is in that list, which is the collection, right? Now, some things to note about the for loops is the temporary variables. A temporary variable's name is arbitrary and does not need to be defined beforehand. Both of the following code snippets do the exact same thing as the example above. So like I said earlier, you don't need like a predefined temporary variable. You can just name it whatever. It can be I, it can be X, it can be item. Doesn't matter, right? Now, programming best practices suggest that we make our temporary variables as descriptive as possible. Since each iteration of our loop is accessing an ingredient, it makes more sense to call a temporary variable ingredient rather than something like I or item. Now, notice the indentation that all of these examples, the print statement is indented. Everything is at the same level of indentation after the for. After the for loop declaration is included in the loop body and is run on every iteration of the loop. If we ever forget to indent, we'll get an indentation error or unexpected behavior. Elegant loops. Now, Python loves to help us write elegant code, so it allows us to write simple for loops in one line. In order to see the below example as one line, you may need to expand it, but yeah, this is what it would look like in one line, basically. It's a one-liner for loop. I suggest not doing this for the time being since we're just starting out, but in the near future, we will be just using just one lines. The one-line for loop are useful for simple programs. It is not recommended that you write one-line loops for any loop that has to perform multiple complex actions on each iteration. Doing so will hurt the readability of your code and may ultimately lead to buggier code. Alright, so we're going to run the code. We should get an indentation error because the print game is not indented. Okay. Yes, we do. Now indent line 6 so that we don't get an indentation error. Okay, we don't get an indentation error. Now write a for loop that prints each sport in the list sport games. So do for sports and sports games print sports. I should call it sport. See, like the variable name does not matter. Let's see, printed on a new line. Let's see what happens. Sports, sport games. There you go. And you see how football, hockey, baseball, and cricket are all printed here. So it's just literally the for keyword, temporary variable, the in keyword, and then the name of the collection, which is the list in our case, and then you print it out. Pretty simple, pretty easy. Moving on to the next one. Now, for loops using range. Often we won't be iterating through a specific list or any collection, but rather only want to perform a action multiple times, a certain action multiple times. For example, if we want to print out a learning loops message 6 times using a for loop, we'll need to follow the structure. For a temporary variable in list of, let's say 6, we need to print learning loops. Notice that we need to iterate through a list with a length of 6, but we don't necessarily care what is inside of the list. To create an arbitrary collection of any length, we can pair our for loops with the trusty range function, which is a built-in Python function. An example of how the range function works: the code generates a large collection of 6 elements from 0 to 5. So 6 steps, range 6. There you go. Now we can use the range directly in our for loops as the collection to perform a 6-step iteration. So we can do for temp in range 6, and it prints it out 6 times like so. Something to note that is that we're not using the temp anywhere inside of the loop body. If we are curious about which loop iteration or step we're on, we can use temp to keep track of it. Since our range starts at 0, we'll add +1 to our temp to represent how many steps it's taken. So if we do for temp in range 6, and then loop is on iteration number, and then you do temp +1, it'll print out how many times it's been printed. Alright, use the range function in a for loop to print out the provided promise variable 5 times. Alright, so the for in for, let's say I love I, right? I is pretty easy to work with. For I in range, now we're printing out 5 times, so we'll just do 4. We can do print promise. Did you loop over a collection created by a range of length 5? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Yeah, need to put 5. There you go. Okay, so in the range one, you do have to put how many you want printed on there. Alright, I'm gonna end the video right there for for loops in Python. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and subscribe if you're new, and have a great day.